Morning, everyone. Dan Bates, President and CEO of Greater Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, and we are glad you could join us today for coffee and conversation. Many of you have joined us on Zoom, and feel free to ask questions of the speaker. If you are joining us on Facebook Live, type in your questions and Tiffany will repeat them to the speaker. So we're glad you could join us. We're very excited to have Nick Ziepfel as our speaker today. So with that, I'm turning it back to Tiffany.
Laura, can you take over real quick? I'm still navigating to Facebook Live, so I can't see anybody right now.
Oh, okay. Yep, we can take care of that real quick. Welcome, everyone. We are excited to have Nick Ziepfel with Graydon with us today. If everybody wants to go around, we'll do some quick introductions so we all know who each other are. This will start at the top of my screen. Judy, you want to start first?
Hi, my name is Judy. I'm with the Chamber of Commerce.
All right, Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy O'Neill with the Greater Hamilton Chamber.
Laurie.
Hi, I'm Lori Santel with Stay Play Made Simple.
Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Gettert with Brown Dawson Flick Funeral Homes.
Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Samlin with EmpowerWorks. Own Your Life, Health, and Wealth. We do education, design, and finance.
Connie.
Hi, I'm Connie Melman. I'm with the Butler County Board of Developmental Disabilities.
Tammy.
Tammy Walton, the Greater Hamilton Chamber.
Karen. No.
I am Karen Baker, and I'm with Baker & Associates CPAs.
And Ann, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, sorry, I was late. My name's Anne Arnett, and I'm with Gateway South Campus.
You're fine. We were just getting started, Ann. Not a problem. So we're excited to have everybody here, and feel free to ask Nick questions. And Nick, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yes, and so thanks everybody for attending, and thanks for the chamber to put these on. These are a great way to stay connected about what everyone's doing and business updates at this time. I do appreciate it, and I do encourage questions both through Zoom and Facebook. Please stop me at any time if you have a question. That I think this is, the idea of the coffee and conversation is a conversation. So I don't want to sit here and speak at you, but rather engage in some dialogue on what I'd like to discuss today. And that's, as you would imagine, legal issues related to COVID, more particular, employment and return to work issues, as we are all starting to see an increase in the return to the regular workplace throughout our city and the county and the state. So please stop me and interrupt me if you have questions, and I will start my conversation with the idea that everything I say today, which I'm required to tell you, is everything I say today is not legal advice. It's merely hypotheticals and analyzing what the guidance is and the current laws are out there on this pandemic and all the legal issues related to it. So if you have a question, please present your question as a hypothetical, and we can hypothetically answer it. So, but again, not legal advice. You're not my clients. I'm not your attorneys. As much as, I'd love to help. For now, this is just a presentation on what we know today. And that's how I'd like to kick it off. I serve as a law director for a local city, and I was in a council meeting in March, and we were passing an ordinance related to the COVID pandemic, and one of the council members looked at me and asked for some advice on, the ordinance, and I gave him my answer, but I responded with, well, unfortunately, I don't have a ton of experience in this arena, but I am learning as I go. This is my first pandemic, so. I think everyone, and we've done a good job of this, everyone has realized that a lot of this is currently evolving, and especially on the legal side and the employment side. And I think everybody can recognize that our leaders and those passing the laws or enforcing the laws are doing the right thing as they can, and continually trying to change and adapt under the information we know about this pandemic and this virus. So while I do recognize the impact it's had, I want to just start it with that kind of idea that, you know, we're all in this together. This is a very, you know, new situation, and a lot of times, you know, our guidance may adapt as the laws kind of change and we gather more information about this. But right now, my first pandemic, and I'm going to go through what I know as of today about return to work issues, which if you know over the last few months, that may change next week based on whether the state or federal guidance changes. So return to work, I hope everyone is at least analyzing how we return to work if they've not stayed in the workplace as an essential business. I wanted to look at the 5 kind of basic ideas that the state of Ohio has published that all employers in the state must require or comply with if you're not an essential business or if you are an essential business. And the first one is kind of the main one that is a hot button topic around, but employees are required to wear face coverings if permissible, unless there's some type of disability that prohibits it. And we can get into those types of issues later if you do have specific questions. And it's encouraged for all clients and customers in the workplace who visit the workplace to wear facial coverings, though not required by the law under the state or federal guidance. So we have face coverings. We have a requirement from the state's guidance to conduct daily health assessments, and at the minimum, that is a self-evaluation. I think we all know what that is to date. You know, certain things like checking your symptoms, checking your temperature. If you have those types of symptoms that are predominant in COVID patients, or if you are running a fever, you're encouraged not to come in the workplace, and employers can prohibit you from being in the workplace. I'm going to discuss further medical examinations in a little bit, but at a minimum, state of Ohio requires that we conduct daily health assessments of our workers. Number 3, maintain good hygiene. That includes social distancing, hands washing, and sanitizing surfaces. What that means varies across the industries. As you could imagine, not every employer or workplace is alike, so that the state has, as you looked at the Responsible Restart Ohio guidance for specific industries, there's different requirements on what we mean about hand washing and sanitizing and social distancing and how to comply with those requirements. And those I'm sure you are very familiar with. They're on the state's website. If you have any questions about those, they're easy to find, and really goes through the specifics of what each industry should require in their workplace to maintain a safe environment, and not what they should require, what they must require. I'm sorry. Number 4, or that was number 3. Number 4 is clean and sanitize the workplaces throughout the workday, at the close of business, or between shifts. That really, again, depends on the workplace and how your work is structured. But again, check the Responsible Restart Ohio guidance for specific requirements for your industry. Whether that's simply wiping down a surface or disinfecting a workplace at the end of the shift, it really just depends on your workplace. So, and the last one is limit capacity to meet the social distance guidelines. Right, we've got a maximum capacity that employers must adhere to, and that varies on the size of your business. It varies on the type of business you have, and if possible, if feasible, use appointments to minimize the traffic, the client or customer traffic through your workplace. And the whole idea of that, as we know, is to minimize the number of people in close proximity to one another, because as far as we can tell through the CDC guidance, the best, or sorry, that's a poor choice of word, the most common way of transmitting this virus is through airborne respiratory droplets in the air. So the more we can minimize the amount of people in close proximity of one another, the better we are to reduce the transmission of the virus. So that's kind of the 5-step overview you're required as an employer in Ohio to comply with. Now, the specifics of each workplace, we could run the gamut. We could spend all day talking about how employers are different and unique, and they must comply with, or they can't comply with this requirement, or they can't require or hand sanitizing every hour, whatever, pick your poison on these requirements. But they're guidelines, and we understand that. As I said before, we're all evolving in this process. We're all trying to figure out the best practice here, and it's not a one-size-fits-all by any stretch of the imagination. So, take these guidance and requirements to heart, and if you have questions about it, contact your local health department and ask the question, hey, how can we do this? How can we comply with this requirement? Because the local health department is the agency in charge of enforcing these requirements. So they are a great resource. I know at the city, I serve as a law director. We've used them as a great resource for questions and for enforcing any violations of this social distancing requirements, or the state of Ohio stay at home or safe at home orders, as we know. I'm not going to get into those that much, but that's kind of the general backdrop I wanted to talk about. But I really want to get into what we're seeing right now and what I've been flooded with over the past 4 weeks. And it's these return to work issues that all employers are facing. And that it's a difficult conversation and things we've had with how to get employees back in the workplace safely or accommodate any requests that they have. So the first one, and we talked about testing. Okay, so we've got this idea that we're required to have these self-evaluations of all employees daily when they come into the workplace. Now, the EEOC guidance, the Department of Labor guidance, all state that yes, you can require medical testing. You can require COVID viral testing for employees to return to the workplace. Practically, I don't think that's feasible at this point, knowing that we have such a the length and turnaround in those tests. But it may be practical for certain workplaces, right? And those workplaces you can evaluate and perhaps it's employees go on a job for a week at a time together, and they're off 7 days on, 7 days, and we could speculate where that would be feasible, but for most of us 9-to-5ers, that's not really feasible, because if you test somebody for the COVID virus on day 1, day 2 they may have contracted it that night. So it really isn't helpful for us. What is helpful are these self-evaluations each day to make certain that symptomatic patients or employees aren't in the workplace, because we have read through the CDC guidance that it's not as likely to transmit the disease or contract the disease through an asymptomatic patient. So again, it's an evolving process. We're trying to work through it. This is kind of the best practice we can evaluate from or offer for most employers. But let's talk about whether what if you decide to test? What if you decide to test at the workplace? And not just the COVID virus test, but what if you decide, hey, I'm going to take your employee's temperature or my employees' temperatures when they walk in the door? Well, the EEOC has stated that is what is called a medical examination. And a medical examination, it's kind of like a term of art in the legal world when it comes to employment law. Medical examinations are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so that information must be kept separate and apart from the employee's typical personnel file. And it must be kept confidential with limited access to that information. The idea is that employees' medical information is private, both under the ADA and HIPAA, and that you must keep that information confidential. It's an extra layer of administration for an employer if they are taking these or conducting these health screens as employees walk into the door. Think about it from a temperature standpoint. If employers are testing the temperature coming in the workplace and writing it down, and I'll get through that in a minute. If they're writing down that temperature to keep a daily log, that daily log that is confidential, it's protected health information. So we need to consider that when we are storing that information or maintaining that information, and who has access to that information. Seems like a far cry from what the ADA and HIPAA was designed to protect, but nonetheless, those are the laws we are bound by and we must comply with. Now, I will tell you, I've got in front of me, this is something that's new. I haven't been able to dive into it too much. This is, something that I like to read at my leisure and my weekends and time off. It's OSHA's, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration's guidance on returning to work. And one great comment I did note in there as I was perusing it, just excited for my leisure reading, was that OSHA considers such medical information protected under federal statutes, which require not only under certain HIPAA and ADA requirements where you must keep that protected health information or that medical examination paperwork for a number of years, perhaps 7 years. Under certain federal laws, you must keep that information. If it's considered a medical examination, you must keep it for 30 years past the termination of the employee. So that is a significant undertaking for any employer, not something we all want to do, where we want to maintain records for 30 years past the employee's tenure at the company. So that's something you need to consider. Now, not all records will qualify for that. It's very case by case. Here's how, I know we've talked about these self-assessments for some time. My recommendation, though, is if you are doing health screens and you want to be certain that no employee is running a fever or that they are showing symptoms when they arrive at the workplace for the day, instead of documenting it, simply have somebody who takes the test and gives a thumbs up or down, not to document that information. Now, if you don't document it, there's no record to keep. So that's one way to not be hamstrung by all of this record keeping requirements. Now, we've talked about medical examinations. Now, one new thing I'm reading through here, hold on. One new thing we saw from the EEOC, I think it was about 10 days ago, is an update to their guidance on antiviral testing, right? And we've seen this antiviral testing as a way to, now don't hold me to this, I'm not a doctor, but it's a way to evaluate whether an employee has been subjected to the coronavirus and is now not symptomatic or suffering from it, but rather immune to it because they have the antibodies in their system. Now, that's one way to, others think that that's one way to make sure their employees are safe, because if they've, in theory, contracted it once, they can't contract it again. I think there's some science against that, but again, I'm not a doctor. Now, the EEOC guidance has said, while medical examinations, COVID tests, or body temperature tests are permitted under the ADA because they are legitimately related to the employee's employment at the company, i.e. keeping the employee safe and keeping the coworkers away from a direct threat. EEOC guidance has said antibody testing is not, because it doesn't, whether that employee had that virus at some point and now does not, is not a way to check for a direct threat to others, and it's not legitimately related to the business of the employer, right? Whether they had it or not in the past doesn't really matter in theory on whether that employee can come to work. So a little different there. The EEOC says, yes, we can test for the virus, but no, we can't test for the antibodies. Just something new and a development there. That's about the best I can explain it right now. If you have any further questions, please yell them out or enter them into Facebook Live. Happy to answer those on the testing. But again, just to take away from that, you're required to, under the state of Ohio, at a minimum, to conduct self-evaluations or require employees to conduct self-evaluations. Make sure they're not symptomatic or running a fever when they come to work. You can check them, but be cautious. If you do make records of those, they will be considered medical examinations and subject to the record-keeping requirements related to medical examinations under the ADA and other federal laws. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is, and I'm going to go over this very briefly. I don't know, I could spend hours talking about the FFCRA and the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the leave imposed under the FFCRA. I mean, we're over, what, 3 months into this, well, 2.5 months, almost 3 months into the actual effective date of this leave, right? That gives you up to 80 hours of paid sick leave for certain coronavirus-related issues, and up to 12 weeks of paid FMLA leave for all employers. Well, did I see a question there? Somehow it popped up on mine.
Nick, Carol Lucio's on Facebook Live. She said, knowing that not all coronavirus cases show with a fever, can an employee refuse to have their temp taken and still be able to go to work?
No, we can require that they take the temperature. And in fact, under the state of Ohio guidance, we are required to conduct daily health assessments of our employees, right? And that includes a self-evaluation that the employee is certified or checked that they are not running a fever or showing any other symptoms. And we are allowed to confirm that. Now, I think I saw something pop up on my Zoom little message here. I'm not very technologically savvy, but it looks like I saw a question related to group spread temperatures.
Yep, so that's from Mike. Is a group spreadsheet to log temps considered a record, or does it have to be individual records to be considered that?
It's a record. It's a record that must be kept as a confidential medical record. Now, the problem you run into when it's a group spreadsheet, I'm glad you asked that, is what do you do if someone requests it? Well, then you're under the requirement, not only do you keep it protected as a confidential medical record, simply like you have an ADA file, a leave file. If you have more than 50 employees, you probably have an FMLA file. You do the same for that spreadsheet. But if someone requests it, you are redacting a lot off that spreadsheet because you cannot disclose any PHI of any other employee other than the employee who requested it or who was given the HIPAA release authorizing the release of that health information.
Just to follow up, can employees waive their HIPAA protection for something like the spreadsheet?
They absolutely can, but it's a signed authorization. There's a HIPAA form, and it's pretty clear. And there's only a 1 year. It's only valid for 1 year. So, yes, but that's a paperwork nightmare in itself, right? Mm-hmm. So the best way to do that is if you are keeping a spreadsheet, and I'm not discouraging that. I'm just saying you need to be aware that you need to keep that spreadsheet confidential and private. And if you do have a request for that information, which I hope you never do, then you're going to need to redact it only to those who have given you the authorization to disclose their PHO.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. So it looks like Connie.
Yep. Connie, is there a federal reimbursement dollars available for the 80 hours of leave required in the bill?
Yes, I was just getting there. Thank you, Connie. So under the FFCRA, you are permitted up to 2 weeks, 80 hours of work, or as a part-time employee's 2-week equivalent of paid sick leave based on either the employee's rate of pay or the federal minimum wage, which it's almost always going to be the rate of pay, up to 100% of the pay, up to $511 daily. So if the employee makes more than $511, it's capped at $511 for $5,110 total. Sorry for all the math there. If they are subject to a state federal, local, or state quarantine or isolation order related to COVID. I haven't seen one of those, right? The stay-at-home order is not an isolation order. Number two, they get the sick leave if they've been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine for reasons related to COVID-19, which we have seen those. Or number three is experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and is seeking a medical diagnosis. Okay, so you get this bucket of leave, and I'm going to go through more of them for these reasons. It's 80 hours or 2 weeks of a part-time employee's pay, up to $511 a day for the reasons I just stated. And that is all reimbursed by the federal government. For most employers, there's hyper-specific employers where they don't receive the federal reimbursement rate or through their tax credit, right, through their quarterly tax filings. It's a tax credit, it's refundable, and you're entitled to that. All employees who are subject, or employers other than the certain carve-outs, I really don't want to get into those because it generally applies to almost all employers. Under 500 employees is the threshold I'd like to just put out there. So if you're subject to the FFCRA, you're likely going to get the reimbursable tax credit for this leave. Now, the 80 hours, here's where everybody got tripped up back in March and early April. The 80 hours permitted under or granted under the FFCRA to all employers under 500 employees, for the most part, is an addition to whatever the employer's already provided, right? So we saw a lot of employers who are generous and great employers who said, listen, we're going to give you extra sick time in your sick bank going forward because of these reasons. Now, if that was offered before the effective date of this law, the employee gets the additional 80 hours. Okay, as long as it's related to these reasons. And that 80 hours, only that 80 hours is reimbursable as a tax credit through the IRS. Okay, so we've got those three reasons I've stated: an isolation order, if you're advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine, or if you're experiencing symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis, you're going to get 100% of your pay, up to 80 hours, up to $511 a day. Now, you will get, during the same time, the 80 hours of leave at 2/3 your pay, up to $200 daily. If you're caring for an individual subject to an order, all right, or if you are advised by a healthcare order, somebody that's, I'm sorry to stumble over that, but somebody who you're caring for, somebody who is subject to a quarantine order or advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine. Okay, so if you need to provide them care, you can take leave as well, right? It's not an additional 80 hours. You get your 80-hour bucket, and you can get that reimbursed at 2/3 of your pay, up to $200 a day. Again, that's an IRS refundable tax credit for the employer as well. And then the last one is the Emergency FMLA Act, EMFMLEA, that provides up to an additional 10 weeks, 12 weeks total. It kind of rolls into that 80 hours we've already discussed. If you have to stay at home and you can't come to work because you are caring for your child whose school or place of care is closed, or the child care provider is unavailable due to COVID-19 reasons. Okay, so we saw a lot of that with the schools when they were closed before summer break, and when the daycares were closed. They still are technically closed to it or open at a very reduced capacity under the state of Ohio Responsible Restart Ohio guidance. So you have those issues where these employees who are not experiencing COVID symptoms, are not caring for somebody who is experiencing COVID symptoms, but instead caring for their own children because they don't have a child care provider because of these COVID reasons. Under that circumstance, you get up to 2/3 your pay, up to $200 a day, for up to 12 weeks. Okay. Now that, as an employee, you can't take that 12 weeks of this emergency FMLA leave and the 80 hours of sick time, right? It's all rolled into one. And this is new. This is very new for employers under 50 employees who have never had to deal with the FMLA. So it's something that is unique, and small employers, I've noticed on both sides, are having a difficult time grasping this and understanding how this can work, because they've never been subject to the FMLA. They don't understand that people get this guaranteed 12 weeks off protected status. Now, there are some exceptions for this leave under the DOL guidance, but generally speaking, the employee is going to get this 12 weeks of paid time off. Again, reimbursable tax credit. Something to consider is if you are over 50 employees, but under 500 employees, so you're that 50 to 500 employee range, you've been subject to the FMLA before. Now you're subject, because you're under 500 employees, to the emergency FMLA that I just described. The employee does not get 12 weeks of FMLA and 12 weeks of this emergency FMLA. They're combined into one. Okay, so the employee in theory couldn't take 24 weeks off in a row and have it protected under these FMLA and EFMLA laws. Just one way to think about that is so I don't have employers out there gasping for breath saying, what the heck is going on? My employees are going to be out half the year. No, well, yes, maybe, and that's what we're going to discuss further. But that's the general parameter of these FFCRA laws related to leave. And they do come into play now that we are starting to return to work, right? Before, if everybody was furloughed or laid off, it didn't really matter about these laws. We do now, as employees come back into the workplace, we know that these laws go through the end of the year, right? The sick leave is permitted through the end of the year. We can all assume through all the experts have told us, and we know generally how viruses work, like the flu virus, that we might see an increase, right? Another curve uptick in coronavirus cases in this fall, and perhaps we haven't ruled out that there's going to be similar isolation or self-quarantine requirements through the state or federal regulations and guidance. So something to keep in mind as we move forward. It's not going away, at least this year, perhaps not even next year. But we need to understand that, just because we're coming back to work, none of this is going away. We're going to have to deal with these laws going forward. And I have it in front of me. One other requirement of the FFCRA is you get this handy dandy poster. It's on the DOL's website, and you need to post it in a conspicuous place in your workplace. Much like numerous other federal laws you employers are aware of, it just simply provides employees the notification of their rights to leave under these laws. We've drafted a number of policies, updated policies for employers, updated leave policies for employers who want a form kind of prepared so that when this leave comes up, they know how to deal with it from an employer perspective, and they know how to categorize this leave in their own payroll processing systems. I mean, we've handled that on the back end. So there is some mechanics involved with that for most employers, but if you are a smaller employer and you're dealing with this, you can handle it on a case-by-case basis. Just be advised that there are a number of regulations out there related to this leave. I mean, the Department of Labor guidance on this, they published almost 70 Q&As, I think, the last I checked, just on how this leave works. That's the quickest way for them to issue guidance as opposed to any formal guidance. They're updating those Q&As all the time. So there's a number of quirks with these laws. Just be aware of them if you are if you get a new one in and you need to evaluate it. Plenty of resources out there for you to look at. So we've got this leave, and we've got how the general idea of how employees should return to work to make sure they're safe, right? We've got the state guidance, Responsible Restart Ohio. We've got kind of the testing measures, how to get them in the workplace, and we've got the leave that they can use once they're in the workplace. Now, what we're starting to see, and I'm sure a number of you have questions about this, is what happens when someone doesn't want to return to work. They've been furloughed for quite some time and they don't want to return to work. And it's generally plain vanilla, hey, I'm still concerned about COVID. I'm not saying I have a disability. I'm not saying I have COVID. I'm just concerned about the workplace. Now, that's from a legal perspective, we're not required to accommodate that, right? And even the state of Ohio has issued guidance requesting that employers who have employees like that and are being generous and saying, okay, you can stay off for a little bit because perhaps we're not at maximum capacity in the workplace and we don't need everybody back. The state of Ohio has requested that employers notify the state of those employees because they technically shouldn't be eligible for unemployment benefits anymore. Okay, so you should notify the state of those types of employees. Now that there's no requirement that you comply with that request, and like I mentioned before, perhaps in your workplace you're not at 100% capacity, so that you don't need all the workers back, so that you're being a good steward, a good employer, and accommodating those who really aren't comfortable yet. But bear in mind, you should report that to the state. They should not be collecting unemployment benefits. I know that sounds harsh, but that is what it is. They've chosen not to return to work. Now, where the rubber really meets the road and what I've been dealing with for a while, it reminds me of, and this is a terrible reference, and I apologize, but I get excited about these laws because it is such a change in the employment arena. And I know the backdrop of it is terrible, and what we've experienced as the economy and as a country. But I'm just excited about the change in the laws because I'm an employment law nerd. It reminds me of Independence Day with Will Smith, when the doctor gets excited about the spaceship turning on, and Will Smith kind of corrects him like, "Hey, remember, we're in the middle of a crisis here." So I apologize if I get excited about these laws. I understand the backdrop of this. I'm very concerned, just like everyone else. But the idea is, where the rubber hits the road is, what happens when you get a request for a reasonable accommodation for employees to stay out of the workplace, right? Not that they choose not to, but that they have a doctor's note that says not, hey, they need to be self-quarantined because they're experiencing symptoms, or that they have contracted the virus, or that they're caring for someone who has the virus, right? All covered under the FFCRA, all reimbursable tax credits. But when an employee says, hey, I've got a disability and I can't come into work because of coronavirus. Now, that A doesn't equal B there, but that's where we're having a tough time as employers, trying to connect the dots there on whether an employee is permitted leave under the ADA and on all the DOL's and EEOC's guidance on the coronavirus, and whether they're not, right? And that we need to run a workplace, right? And we're not in the situation here where we can just grant them leave because, hey, we only need half our staff back. But this is an essential employee. There are poor term of art because of what we're dealing with, but this is a critical employee, and we need this employee in the workplace as we ramp up operations. The employee has submitted a request to stay off work. What do we do? And the EEOC, as you would imagine, does not give us a clear-cut answer, because every situation, if you've ever had to deal with a request for leave under the ADA, every situation is unique. But one thing we are required to do is engage in the interactive process, meaning we receive the request for some type of accommodation. In this case, it would be leave related to this disability, and it's connected to coronavirus somehow. Now, when we get that, we are allowed to ask as employers certain questions of that leave or of that request. And, that's where the rubber is going to meet the road. So this is, we can push back and we can ask, about the disability. And this is where we're going to push back and say, hey, we've got all these safety measures in place. We're complying with the state of Ohio guidance. We want these employees to come back to work in a safe manner, but there's still this request that due to this disability, they have a heightened risk of contracting COVID-19 or having severe symptoms from contracting COVID-19. We've seen the CDC guidance on that, and how do you deal with that? Well, the EEOC has said, yes, we can push back and we can ask a number of questions from the employee's medical provider. I recommend you go through the employee for that. And you can ask about how that disability creates that need for leave, and how the request for leave just to be out of the workplace is the only possible measure that could help the employee, that could be an accommodation for this employee. You know, the idea is, well, this employee can't, is at a severe risk of contracting coronavirus. Well, that I understand that and I empathize with that. But at the same time, if we have, as an employer, put together certain accommodations to prevent contact with that employee with other individuals or clients and customers that could sufficiently protect that employee under these circumstances, that can be considered a reasonable accommodation. And the employer gets the final say in which accommodation is chosen, as long as they're all reasonable and they sufficiently protect that employee. So that's where this interactive process comes back and forth. And I've dealt with these a number of times over the last few weeks. Our job is not, as employers, is not to simply tell the employee what they will provide, or at the same time just accept the employee physician note that says they need to be off leave. We have to evaluate why there's a need for leave, and what measures in the workplace that we could change to give the employee and the employer a reasonable accommodation that fits the circumstances. I'm dealing with one right now where we talk about perhaps moving this employee to another area that has less foot traffic around it from clients and customers, even though in the front area there was the plexiglass and the coverings from the clients and customers. Putting the employee somewhere else to, again, reduce that foot traffic may be sufficient, right? And or take any other measures, right? I've had one where this is not on a return to work issue, but it sort of is. The employees, you see these requests for, or at least I have, for an employee to state that he or she can't wear a mask, right? They have some disability that prevents them from wearing a mask in the workplace. Okay, that's a very tricky one, but to have that employee without a mask around other employees, we could argue poses a direct threat to the coworkers. But one reasonable accommodation is to move that employee to another area where there's not as much foot traffic with coworkers, or to have that employee work a different shift, whatever it may be. The same idea goes for requests for leave of absence under due to COVID, risks of contracting COVID. So I can't give you a specific example because, like I said, everyone is unique. But I want employers to be very mindful that they need to be very flexible in employees' requests for that, for leave, or for some type of accommodation related to the risk of contracting coronavirus in the workplace. And that's, of course, assuming that the request for leave is related to a disability that heightens the risk of contracting COVID or experiencing those severe symptoms. Think about temporarily, and the EEOC has permitted this, temporarily reassigning essential functions from that job. And the EEOC is in uncharted waters where they, before we've got these essential functions of the job that we should never need to accommodate from, right? That we can't shift those. That is the essential duty of the job. The employee needs to be able to perform that with or without reasonable accommodation. The EEOC has said, well, in this pandemic time, we can reassign some of those essential functions temporarily. And later, once something lifts or changes, we can put those essential functions back into that position and require the employee complete those functions. Now, historically, the issue with that is if you can reassign an essential function once, then it's not an essential function. It's considered a reasonable accommodation, and you must give that accommodation down the road. The EEOC has said, no, we can temporarily do that and still protect that essential function status for any certain duty this employee has, just given this coronavirus pandemic. We can temporarily transfer people to other divisions to other areas and not, again, this is all temporary, and move that position back once the risk of coronavirus lessens, right? And so we're in this uncharted water where we've got this more flexibility from an employer. We've always had that flexibility, but we've always risked not keeping those essential functions if we did make that accommodation this time. The EEOC has said, no, employers, we're going to give you a free pass to just be as flexible as possible, and we're not going to hold you to that standard down the road once this coronavirus pandemic lessens. That's what they've said. Time will tell whether that's what they really mean, but we do need to try to be as flexible as possible, because on the flip side of that is, let's say we do not accommodate as an employer, and you have a charge filed with the EEOC, OCRC, or a lawsuit filed that says, this employee was not permitted some type of accommodation due to the coronavirus. I really wouldn't want to be the test case there. I think that's going to be a tough row to hoe as an employer. We need to be as flexible as possible, and we need to a degree, right? And we still need to run our business, but we need to give the employee as much opportunity to perform the essential functions of his or her job. And that might be 3 or 4 back and forth with the employee and the employee's physician to see if we can come to some reasonable accommodation that works for both sides. So let's see, that's really what I have on the reasonable accommodation stuff. I mean, we engage in the interactive process. The EEOC's guidance is great on this, but it really comes down to the specific circumstances of each request and each job. We've dealt with those almost every day. I do want to flip, though, to the last thing, which is I don't like to end this way. So let me get through this. If you have any questions, please ask them. But the last thing I want to talk about is what happens if we come back to work. We have everybody in the workplace, and we get a case of coronavirus in the workplace. The state has issued guidance on this, and we've dealt with these scenarios before. The first thing is we need to report the employee or customer infections to the local health district, right? So in our county, Butler County Health District, we need to work with that, we need to work with the health district to identify the exposed individuals, to notify those exposed individuals, right? The CDC has guidance on who was in close contact with the infected individual. They have specific parameters on that, and we decide, all right, sorry about that. We decide, who needs to be notified of that, and we need to discuss the appropriate contact tracing. We need to shut down the workplace when possible to sanitize and disinfect and professionally clean and sanitize. And then we can reopen with the consultation of the local health department. So it's, right, we need to immediately report it to the local health district. We need to work with the health district to find out who was potentially around in close contact with the infected individual, notify them. We need to shut down the workplace, clean and sanitize it. Now, shut down doesn't mean immediately, right? It could mean at the end of the shift. It could mean at the end of the day. Again, we're in uncharted waters. Everybody's trying to work to be as efficient and as possible given our unique workplaces. And once we professionally clean and sanitize it, we need to reopen it with consultation of the local health department. Now, I've seen this happen overnight at workplaces. Not a problem for local health departments, okay? They understand this. They can come in and they can say, okay, shut it down at night. We have a cleaning company. You notify them, show them we have a cleaning company coming in, professionally cleaning it, and we can go from there. Just something you need to be aware of. You can't just continue business as normal when one person has, contracted it or showed up to work with the coronavirus. So, I don't like to end on a low note like that, right? Talking about what if we have coronavirus in the workplace. So please, if someone has a question, let's end on a positive note here. So do we have any there, Tiffany?
No others on Facebook Live, so we'll just open it up to those right now. If you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Nick.
Here, I've got one thing I did forget to mention. I've got a neat case here I've been reading, and again, terrible choice of words, my employment law hat's on. But this is a case filed in the state of California against McDonald's or a franchisee of McDonald's who allegedly took no action related to the state's guidance on opening and safe spaces, and in that caused employees to become more infected. This was a complaint to essentially shut down the business. And it's before the state on a temporary restraining order shutting down the business and suing for a number of claims. Something we don't ever want to be as an employer. As an employer, please follow the state of Ohio guidance. You might have a complaint from an employee that goes to the local health district who can enforce these laws. They are enforceable because they are issued by the state of Ohio Department of Health. There are statutes that note that a violation of the state of Ohio Department of Health, an intentional violation, is an M2 misdemeanor and subject to fines. More importantly, though, I've dealt with these before. If employers know there's something called an intentional tort, where generally injuries or infections in the workplace are subject to Bureau of Workers' Comp, but if you intentionally subject somebody to a risky situation, knowing that they could be injured or infected, that is a tort outside of the workers' compensation system that an employee could bring against the employer. And not only would you have to deal with that tort, I suspect I see a few cases coming out of this new pandemic in this area of intentional tort law in the state of Ohio. And the last one is, you certainly don't want that idea of not complying with the state's orders to prevent infectious diseases going to OSHA, who requires that we take certain health measures to prevent the spread of infectious diseases in the workplace. So again, please comply with the state of Ohio guidance on this. Let's have a safe workplace and open up and continue to move forward. And hopefully we can beat this thing in the next few months, but although we do suspect it'll be around for a couple of years. I did see a question come up, right, Tiffany?
Yep, Connie has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, it was too long to type, and I apologize if you can hear my dogs snoring in the background because they're snoring very loud. But anyhow, this is more of for customer base. Can you do a hypothetical on a customer going into a place of business? If I have a hypothetical to give you, if that's okay.
Let's hear your hypothetical. Yes.
Hypothetically, I received a phone call from a family who has a child with a disability. They were going into an eye doctor for the child. When they went in, they asked the mother to put a mask on, which was fine. And they were in, looking at the glasses, waiting for their appointment. And another employee of the eye doctor came over and said that their 2-year-old had to put on face mask. That is the patient, the 2-year-old. And when the mom said, he's not going to keep it on, he's autistic, the employee said to her, prove it. So it turned into a not so nice situation. So I think one thing is getting word out, through maybe our local chambers on educating people about some people who have disabilities that might not be able to wear the face mask. But also, what would you do if you were that parent? Do you just leave or do you follow up, or
if you're hypothetically, if you're the parent, there's a lot of state of Ohio guidance on who must wear a mask. There's no requirement I think there's exceptions for children under the age of 6. Now employers are not required to require, you're as a customer, you're not required to wear a mask unless the private employer says you are, right? So they have service. But there are exceptions, right? If you have disabilities, they need to be able to provide a reasonable accommodation there. A response quickly to say, prove it. I think I'm uncomfortable with that, right? Because you're requiring somebody to disclose PHI, right then and now in front of everyone else. I would perhaps call the company, and then if they're going to take that stance, right, the person who enforces this would be if you want to go to the local health district, or if you want to contact the EEOC, right? I've dealt with the EEOC investigators the last few months who are serving as resources, and Department of Labor investigators who used to be field officers, right? Now they're serving on the phones, right? Just fielding calls that come in with questions on this. So they're a great resource just to contact an EEOC hotline on this and say, hey, how do we do this? How do you deal with this accommodation issue? But just again, and Connie, your hypothetical is great because it explains, well, we don't have the right answers for everything yet.
Right.
But even more so, if we come into this this pandemic thinking, well, it's black and white, this is what you must do every single time, we're going to get situations that are unreasonable and that cause conflict. We're all in this together. This is our first pandemic, right? We have changing guidance. Everybody needs to just lighten up, Francis, and be a little nicer and try to understand that we're all working through this guidance together. In this situation, to say prove it, I would almost contact the company and say, what's going on? Can you help counsel your employees on what they need to be asking before I took it much further, right? Because that's me be accommodating to an employer.
Well, and I had thought, the thing that I would have done if I was an owner of a business said, can we accommodate you with an appointment at the end of the day so you're the only ones here, instead of taking it to the level of, it could turn into a yelling argument. So, but yes, I think following up with the company is the best. So thank you for that advice.
Not a problem.
Nick, I have a question. Back to Connie's hypothetical situation. It's my understanding that due to certain medical conditions, the mask cannot be required. So, so they're kind of in risky territory there. But anyway.
Yeah, I agree. But to say, that's where I said poor choice to say prove it right then and there. As an employer, sometimes you need to just pump the brakes, and if someone claims they have a disability that prevents them from wearing a mask, maybe you just accommodate it without going further, right? Because you don't want to call that question, especially in front of everyone right then on the spot. Requirement that they, this mother carry papers that confirms her son is, autistic. Poor choice there by the employer. Again, we need to be everybody needs to be accommodating here and work through these issues together.
So my actual question comes back to, obviously an employer wants to be very careful going down that path of taking temperatures and creating medical records that they have to keep, for 30 years after the employee's no longer there. How much of this?
Not all 30 years, right? That's just under certain federal guidance. If they do qualify, it's still up in the air. But at the very minimum, I would keep them probably 7 years.
But how much of that can be put on the honor system for the employer and the employees into stating and posting that the expectation is that the employee does a self-evaluation before they come to work each day? Or does the employer have to ask that question every day?
No, I think that's best practice. That's what's required by the state of Ohio. The idea is that you must have them perform what's called a self-assessment. And if they are experiencing the COVID symptoms, some of them, or are running a fever, that they should not report to work. And that's more of what you said, the honor system, right? And that's the baseline. Now, you can go further, and it depends, right? It depends on the workplace you're in. It depends on what these employees, who they're interfacing with all day. And some employers might want to take the test just to be certain because of the more sensitive areas of these employees. I'm just saying at a very baseline, you must require self-assessment.
Okay. And my second question is,
yep.
Second question is, are there any requirements out there as far as face masks and what that looks like? There's shields, there's face masks, there's all kinds of things. So face mask, and I'm just sitting here thinking, could a face mask even be handheld? for, people that have, hearing aids and stuff like that. Face masks are very, very difficult.
You're right.
So nobody's come out with a handheld, but I think I might develop one and put it on the market.
Well, you are right where I was and have been for the last 3 months, right? Because anytime I hear there's a requirement, I just want to see what the definition is. That's the lawyer in me. I want to push the bounds of it just for my own edification. And what is a face mask? Well, what is a face covering is what we're getting to now. I can't really answer that, right? I've seen them where I saw some that were hand knitted. That doesn't really help. But at the same time, does that qualify as a face mask? There's not real guidance on that. The idea is that, again, we're all trying to do the best we can here, and we're on these emergency measures. We can poke holes in them left and right where they make no sense. But that if we take that approach, and I agree with you, we did this just to evaluate it and to see how difficult it is to enforce a requirement for face coverings. But hopefully we all we do that in jest and not in all seriousness, trying to evade these rules. And I know you're not, Dan, but that's the idea. I have seen for those who are hearing impaired, I have seen masks that are clear in the front so that you can see the lips move as they sign. I have seen those, but I don't know. I can't tell you whether the state of Ohio, I'm almost certain they'll say a face shield will be sufficient, right? The clear face shields we've seen. But that's a very fluid concept at this point.
Nick, this is Mike Gettert. I have one real quick question. I could have a legal pad full of questions with the business we're in, with the funeral home. We have so many different exposure points. And what I was wondering, as long as we're providing protective equipment for the employees, we knowingly send them into risk environments. When we have a death from COVID, we have the deceased, we have the family that's been exposed and all that. Is it protecting the funeral home from legal exposure as long as we provide the necessary PPE and disinfecting equipment and that for them?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but the funeral home is an essential business, right?
Yes.
Yes. And so we haven't seen this challenged yet, but the idea is that if the concept in our mind is if you comply with the state's requirements, right, and you get the blessing, not that you have to apply for it, but if you have those state requirements in place, the idea is that you have prepared, according to the state, a work environment that is safe for your employees from the coronavirus. Now, there's a risk at all times that we could contract coronavirus in the workplace. The degree of that risk under the state's guidance should be minimized. And that's the reason we have those measures in place. So absolutely. The last thing I think, comply with the state guidance, right? That helps you reduce the risk from an employer standpoint. But on the other side of it, as you can imagine, if you don't comply with the state's guidance and something does go awry, that's where we may see some trouble.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, well, we're about 5 minutes over. That was great information, Nick. Dan, do you have any last comments to wrap up?
No, I appreciate your time. I hope everyone's learned something, and I hope we can all work together and continue to open our workplaces and get back to work to the extent we can.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nick, and thank you all for attending.